Hello, everyone, on the New England Dyslexia Solutions business page. I wanted to come on live. I just finished an assessment with an absolutely awesomely dyslexic client who is signed up to come for a dyslexia bootcamp program in the near future. But one of the things that was so interesting about my conversation with her and her mother was this idea that dyslexia is kind of across the board. People agree that it is the lack of phonemic awareness. And this mom was actually a para in school system and has struggled, like many of my client parents, to understand why it is so challenging for their dyslexic child to actually master all of the blends, like the phonemic sounds and the blends and how you can go over it and over it and over it, and it just doesn't seem to. And so when you have a situation like that where your child is struggling and we are looking at all kinds of phonics instruction, it can seem like it is the best way to go, because in a lot of cases, dyslexic students will appear to not be able to understand the rules of language and be able to implement that into their life. So we're trying to teach them how to do that. But one of the things that I talk about with my clients is that there are essentially two ways of thinking. So I wanted to kind of explain to my future client why it's so hard for her to actually take the information that she's learning in her special ed classes and actually apply them into life. And she was so frustrated with the whole process. Actually, it was almost like she was pretty much like done with reading, and that it gets really hard for her. And I asked her, so what happens for you when you're reading? And she said, well, it's just really confusing. I'm trying to sound out a word. It doesn't make sense. I don't recognize the word. And there are all these words that are coming up that I don't really understand what they mean. And then I start to get really confused. And when I get confused, it gets worse. And it ends up leading to an experience of what we call disorientation, which is that, for her, the words would like shake and move like this. And when you have that happening for you while you're reading, it's a perceptual distortion. But when you have that happening, then it skews your ability to be able to understand what you're reading. So if you're logging on, I would love it if you could tell me who's here and give me any feedback or questions. This is a live event, so if you are here and you do have questions about what I'm talking about, it's super fun just to throw the question out there. And let me know where you're from and what you're dealing with. So anyway, back to this idea of phonemic awareness and the lack of it when it comes to dyslexic readers. And so how I explain to my clients is that ultimately dyslexia is a thinking style. And there are two ways of thinking. And one way is thinking with the sound of words in your mind, and the other way is thinking in pictures. And predominantly, a person with dyslexia is a nonverbal thinker, which is a really cool way to think. And actually, I am a nonverbal thinker, so I totally get it, right? It is a process of thinking where you are using pictures. Okay, so the thought process for someone who is dyslexic is predominantly in pictures, and it's very realistic in nature. So, if I'm thinking I need to go to the store, I'm actually picturing myself getting into the car and driving to the store, and I can picture the store in minute detail. I could walk around the store in my imagination. Someone who thinks with language is going to hear the words, I need to go to the store, in their mind, and it's a verbal thing. And everybody has the ability to think in pictures. It's just that the level of which you think in pictures, and then also the level of verbal thought that is there in your thinking process. Okay, so someone who thinks in both language and in pictures, then they kind of flip back and forth, and reading will be easy for them, and then they also may be able to use their imagination. When you start to go down the bell curve of dyslexia, it's like the more pictures you get and the less verbal thought that there is. And so when we're talking about teaching a dyslexic to use the phonemes and to use language, how it's actually intended is that, each letter has a spoken sound, and then when you string those sounds together, that creates the word that when you are speaking the word, that's what you hear. But of course, we know that in at least the English language, there are so many differences, right? So the word scissors does not look the way it sounds. So there are all these different words and areas where it can get confusing, and we have a lot of rules about language that can be really hard to grasp and hold on to as someone who thinks in pictures. So the lack of phonemic awareness means that there is not awareness of phonemes. And so when you really think about what that means, awareness is when you are able to perceive something, when you are able to become aware of it and actually kind of grab onto it, anchor to it, and have it process, right? So the lack of phonemic awareness means that there is not awareness there. And in the beginning stages, when you have a struggling reader, the very typical way to go about this is to teach them with the phonics instruction, right? Which can, for a non-dyslexic or someone who's mildly dyslexic, it can actually, start to take hold. But if you do not have verbal thought as part of your thinking process, then learning those phonemes are going to be very, very challenging, if not impossible. And it's also, it's like one thing to just learn them in a classroom setting where you're one-on-one and having flashcards and things like that, and a whole nother thing when you start to look at applying that in reading, okay? Because there's so many different rules. Like even the TH can sound different depending on the word, or the ch sound can not always make that sound. So when you're having to go back and forth and you don't have the verbal thought that's happening that supports that, then it can be extremely challenging to get those rules and everything to stick with someone who's dyslexic. So we just take a different route around this, where we need to be coming from the picture thinking side of instruction and understanding that if there is not awareness there, that we can actually come around from the other side and help clients with the picture thinking to be able to understand what words are, how they're created, the different letters that might cause them problems. So not only are letters a problem with just the sound of the letters and the fact that even like the letter A, for example, has 4 different sounds, and which sound is it? So when you see an A, which sound do you actually pick to go with it? You've got to end up having a whole word recognition, which is how all natural readers are, how it comes about. So, if you look at, a reader that is natural and is just flowing, they're not looking at each letter and sounding out each letter. They're looking at the word, and it actually will register as what the word is, and then they move on to the next word. So I hope that makes sense. And I see that somebody's on, so if you can give me a little thumbs up if that makes sense to you, that would be great. So when we are talking about the letters, and this is something that we actually go through with when I work with a client, we're actually starting from ground zero. We're working on this idea of being able to just focus, to be present, to be able to be with the task that you're doing. And that's a pretty simple mental technique, but it is really helpful. But then we start from ground zero and we start looking at letters, because there are so many reasons aside from just the sounds that can be confusing for someone with dyslexia. So I have had clients over the years, like, the only way they know how a K goes is that it looks like a sideways picnic table. And they can't get that out of their head, or they have associations with letters that have been taught to them early on, but they've made it into a picture. So they look at an A and they get a picture of an apple, or there can be all kinds of confusions that are actually preventing the reading from coming in easily. And if you have someone with dyslexia either in your classroom or your child or even yourself, then it's important to understand these things so that you can understand how to help them. Usually tricks and ways to remember things are really just coping mechanisms that aren't full-on mastery of these letters. So that's what we work on. We work on mastery of all of the letters, and all of the punctuation and all of the things that we are supposed to learn very, very early on, but sometimes we either weren't developmentally ready, or we just hadn't developed any verbal thought, or and we still may not have it. Okay, so those are all things to consider when you're working with someone with dyslexia. So I hope that helps to explain why sometimes, I remember even with my own son, he was in 5th grade before we figured out that he was dyslexic, and we had tried everything under the sun to help him. We had tried all kinds of phonics, and I remember getting, quote unquote fired by our tutor because, she was a wonderful woman. He loved going to her because he felt like at least he was, getting some help. But after about a year of tutoring, she said, I'm so sorry, but like, I've done everything I know how to do, and I just don't think this is helping him. Like, he still doesn't get the ch sound, right? And so, at the time, this was like so horrifying and scary because I didn't know where to turn. Because we had kind of exhausted all of the other ways of going about getting help. And then I ended up finding the book, The Gift of Dyslexia. So if you're on here, you may know that that's the program that is based on the book, The Gift of Dyslexia. And when I read that book, it was like, bing, 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 oh my goodness, this explains so much about my son and how he thinks. We went on to have him go through the program. It literally shifted everything for him, at which point I left my corporate career, went through all of the training, and established New England Dyslexia Solutions in 2006. And I've worked with so many amazing clients over these years, and really have been able to help them to lay that groundwork that they need. It's almost like there's so much that's being missed in those younger years where there just was confusion, and things build up. And so we kind of need to undo some things and then rebuild. And from there, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, those all of the interventions that they've had that do involve phonemic awareness start to make sense, because now they have something to map it to. They have an understanding of what's going on. They have their confusions with the shapes of the letters, like the B and the D and the P and the Q, and maybe the capital M and the capital W, or how those can all just kind of switch. And when they switch, when you're talking about a letter and you're looking at a letter as an object, really it's only in language where you can take an object and shift its orientation and it will change its meaning. Okay, so in the real physical world, when we have a pen, no matter which way you look at it, right, the meaning doesn't change. It's still a pen and you can still recognize it. But when it comes to letters, and you are a picture thinker and you're looking at things as objects, then that's where like the shape confusion can come into play. And until you can get that shape or that symbol to anchor and to be able to be itself, rather than, okay, this is just a backwards B, for a D, right? Then once we have that so that it's all anchored in and clear and solid, then we can move on to being able to read and being able to, like, because if you can't recognize a B as a B, then it's really like that's the least of your problems, is trying to know what the sound is. It's like you first have to get to understanding and seeing what the letter is. So I hope that makes sense. So I just wanted to come on. It's been a while since I came on live, and I'm hoping to actually come on more frequently with some more notice. But just had a client leave and thought that it would be an interesting topic, because I know that she was super relieved to finally understand why she has been struggling so much with learning the blends and learning those phonetic sounds that have been confusing her, but she didn't understand why it was confusing, and she didn't understand, like the whole thinking style thing. So it's super helpful when you can understand it. Then you can move forward in your life and have a better sense as to what you need and where to go in the future. So with that, if nobody has any questions, I will say goodbye, but I will be seeing you around, and we'll be coming on live a lot more. Okay, thanks a lot. Have an awesome day. Bye.